An intermediate pressure gauge, or IP gauge, is an important part of every Save a Dive kit. But we need to know how to use this for diagnosing problems at the dive site or on the dive boat. To understand when and how we use this, though, we've got to have a pretty good understanding of our regulator system. So back to the basics, first stage and second stages. The first stage reduces the pressure to an intermediate pressure. The second stages reduce that pressure to ambient pressure. And in the regulator, we've got a low pressure side and a high pressure side. You can see high pressure is labeled HP for those high pressure ports, which are also a different diameter. Now our high pressure is measuring straight off of the cylinder. So if the cylinder has 3000 PSI, we'll see that on our submersible pressure gauge. Now the low pressure side is going to be much lower than 3000 PSI, typically in the 140 PSI range. And that's what gets delivered to our second stages, which then reduce that 140 PSI to whatever the ambient pressure is. So our intermediate pressure gauges measure the low pressure side of this first stage. And they can connect either in between the second stage and the hose or directly onto a low pressure inflator hose. There's a couple of scenarios where an intermediate pressure gauge comes in handy. The first is when we service our regulators. So when you service a first stage, you need to adjust that intermediate pressure so that it is at the manufacturer's specifications. And we'll also adjust the second stage so that it breathes comfortably, and we measure that using a tool called a magnehelic gauge. Now, this is the kind of intermediate pressure gauge that we would use. This is a combo that attaches onto the second stage, and we can adjust the second stage cracking effort as well as monitor the intermediate pressure here. Adjusting the intermediate pressure on the first stage differs with types of regulators, but typically it's something like an Allen key at the end. I wouldn't suggest messing with the intermediate pressure on your first stage unless you're a qualified service technician. However, you should still have an IP gauge and be familiar with it because it can help you diagnose problems. So a common example is we're on the dive boat and we've got a second stage that keeps hissing. Even though we've adjusted the inline adjustment all the way to the right, which should make it the most restrictive, it's still free-flowing slightly. We can take our intermediate pressure gauge and hook it up to our low pressure inflator and see what happens. Now, if that pressure gauge goes to the correct intermediate pressure for the regulator, somewhere between 140 and 150, depending on the manufacturer, then we can determine that the problem is the second stage. If that intermediate pressure continues to climb after 150 and then the second stage begins free flowing, then we've determined that there is a high pressure creep on the seat in the regulator. If we're qualified to do so, there's certain adjustments that we can make on the dive boat to tune this second stage down and still save the dive and not have a leaky free flowing regulator. IP gauges are great to have in the toolkits. I'm a big fan of them, and I suggest that people not only get one, but also have the understanding to diagnose the common problems and apply common fixes. And you can always get more information from service technicians, mentors, or by taking something like an equipment service class. So hopefully that helps out. Thank you for watching.